go. All right. So we are studying the period of time between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New. And we had gotten down to the point where the Jews are beginning to rebel against Seleucid control after Antiochus IV just went haywire on the city of Jerusalem, massacred a bunch of Jews, passed a bunch of laws that were contrary to, or actually forced them to violate the law of Moses, sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple to Zeus, and set up an image of Zeus in the temple. And so he provoked this rebellion, which I think anybody who's much of a student of history probably saw that coming. Because you push people far enough, they're going to push back, and that's exactly what happened. And so we had looked at this history with Antiochus and the massacre of the Jews in 167, all of these laws that he had passed. And then we see in 167 that this man by the name of Mattathias in the city of Modin, who was a Levite, was called upon by the Seleucids to officiate at a sacrificial rite to one of the Greek gods, and he refused. And when he refused, another Jew stepped up to take his place. By the way, the incentive that the Greeks were offering was that he would be called a friend of the king if he did so. In other words, a friend of Antiochus. Another Jew steps up to perform the rite, and Mattathias kills him, and then kills the Greek soldier who was there to enforce the proceedings. And that was sort of the spark that begins what we know as the Maccabean revolt. Now, Mattathias had 5 sons, and we're going to see how we progress through the first generation of the revolt with the lives of these 5 sons. Let me suggest this to you. When you're studying the history between the Testaments and you get down to the Maccabean revolt and the subsequent history leading down to the New Testament, it's helpful to me to try and stratify that history by generations. If you can do that, if you can keep the generations together in your mind, it helps so that all of these names don't just start running together. Because once we get into what we call the Hasmonean dynasty, which is the descendants of Mattathias, who for a short while set up a kingdom and have some level of sovereignty, things get very twisted really quickly. There's a lot of intrigue and a lot of conspiracies and attempts to assassinate different ones, and it helps me to keep them straight by remembering who belongs to which generation. So this is what we might call the first generation of the Maccabean revolt, not including Mattathias because he dies in the first year of the revolt. Okay, so it really is his sons who lead the revolt, and specifically the eldest son, Judas Maccabeus. Now, does anybody remember from last week what we said Maccabee means?
Hammer.
The hammer, yeah, Judas the hammer. And he was sometimes referred to as the hammer of God. Okay, so 167, Mattathias kills this Jew and this Greek soldier, gets this whole thing kicked off. He dies the next year. 165 is the Battle of Emmaus, and in 164, Antiochus dies. And Lysias, who's his general, who has been basically directing the efforts to put down this revolt, he goes back to Syria, and when he does that, he leaves Jerusalem exposed. Well, Judas leads his rebel alliance, you might call it, into the city of Jerusalem as victors. And the first thing they do is to set about cleansing the temple from all of this defilement that Antiochus had set up and reestablishing the worship of God in the temple under the law of Moses. All right? So the second phase then of the revolt begins once they're holding Jerusalem. Now, the reason I separate phases here is this. Up until they hold Jerusalem, this is almost purely a guerrilla warfare type effort. Look at the terrain here that we're talking about in the middle part of Judea. See how mountainous this is? And if we could zoom in, you would see that it's not nice smooth mountains like we have over in East Tennessee. This is very craggy, rough, almost maybe comparable if you've ever seen the Badlands in the Dakotas or in the Southwest. Somewhat comparable to that in the way that there are caves and little canyons and things like that. And so there are millions of places for, guerrilla warfare to take place and for guerrilla warriors to hide and ambush and all of this sort of stuff. And so that's what they're doing. They're striking from hidden locations at, strategic times and places, and then melting back into the environment. But now the second phase begins. They're holding territory. And that changes the character of the warfare. Once you're holding territory, you've got something you've got to protect. And you've got to hold it and protect it and then try to expand on it. And so that's what's going on in the second phase. And the second phase begins in 162. Judas leads out his army to lay siege to a citadel at Acre. And while he's at that, the Seleucids come and lay a counter siege to the city of Beth Zur. Okay, so they say, well, we're not going to come and try to beat you at Acre. We're just going to attack one of your cities. Now you got a choice to make if you're Judas, right? What do? Do you keep besieging the citadel in the hopes of capturing it? Or do you abandon the siege and go try to protect your territory? Tough choice, right? And while he's at it, attacking Beth Zur, there is the Battle of Beth Zechariah. This is 162. In the middle of that battle, Eleazar Avaron, the second son, dies. He's actually crushed by an elephant. Bad way to go. You remember a few weeks back when we were talking about the original generals of Alexander who split up the kingdom, and we talked about how Seleucus had gone and procured those elephants and their riders from over in India. Well, the Seleucids saw what a tactical advantage that gave them on the battlefield, not only just because of the strength and might of the elephants, but also because horses are terrified of them. And so the other guy's cavalry is basically ineffective if you have elephants. And so they used elephants to good purpose. And sure enough, in the Battle of Beth Zechariah, they're using elephants, and that's how Eleazar dies. I've put a star or an X here beside him because he didn't live long enough to ever be a leader in the movement, not like his three of his brothers were. Okay? Well, in the midst of all of this, the Seleucids execute a fellow named Menelaus. Anybody remember who Menelaus was? We talked about him last week.
The high priest.
He was the high priest. Why would they execute him?
Because he was a puppet.
He was a puppet. He wasn't a legitimate high priest. He wasn't in the line of descent. He had been appointed by the Seleucids.
Just to gain favor?
What's that?
Wanted to gain favor?
Yeah, I mean, it was a political favor. Sure was. And they executed him to try and placate these rebels. In other words, from the point of view of the Seleucids, this whole thing got started with this whole rebellion in Jerusalem over Menelaus. Remember, that's what Antiochus found when he came back to Jerusalem. They had run his high priest out of town. And so he starts all of this to put Menelaus back in the high priesthood. And the Seleucids look at it and say, is it really worth it to us to expend all of this money and all of these soldiers and resources and time to fight this rebellion if all they're upset about is this political appointee in the high? Just kill him off and be done with him. So they do kill him off. That's all fine and good, except they appoint somebody else. They missed the point. Now, the man they appointed was a little bit more savvy. Alcimus is his name. He was a little bit more savvy because at the beginning, at least, he was seen as someone who was much more friendly to the Jews and their traditional way of doing things. Now, as we mentioned last week, he lured a group of the Hasidim, who may have been the forerunners of the Pharisees. He lured them into an ambush and killed them. But at least initially, this was seen as an improvement. But the big problem is, he still doesn't have any business being high priest. The Seleucids were not God's instrument to appoint high priests. God had already set out the criteria for appointing a high priest, okay? So they've got Alcimus now as high priest, and Nicanor is appointed military governor. Now you have the Battle of Adasa, not Asada. Evidently, when I wrote that last week, I was thinking about delicious Mexican steak, but it's not Asada as in carne. It's Adasa. And the Battle of Adasa is interesting because it was a stinging victory, a stinging defeat for the Seleucids, a great victory for the rebels. Nicanor had walked through the city of Jerusalem and perceived that there was sympathy for the rebels. And he made a threat loudly that if the rebel sympathy didn't cease from Jerusalem, he was going to burn down the temple. Well, you know how the Jews felt about the temple. And so word spread like wildfire that he had blasphemed the temple. Well, Judas gets word of this. And he sets up a situation whereby he can catch Nicanor at a disadvantage and rout his soldiers. And the history tells us that in order to pump up his own soldiers, Judas tells them about a vision or a dream that he had had where the prophet Jeremiah had handed him a golden sword as if to say, you are commissioned by God to lead this war effort and drive these infidels out of the land and reestablish the kingdom of Judah. Well, his soldiers were greatly enthusiastic about that, and they go out and they catch Nicanor at a disadvantage. They kill him. They cut off his head and his hand and leave his body behind, and it's a great victory for their cause. Well, everything's going well until 160 at the Battle of Elasa. You see, Nicanor dies. The Seleucids aren't just out of generals. They appoint a man by the name of Bacchides to be their general. And Bacchides turns out to be quite a bit more crafty than Nicanor had been. He leads 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry into Judea. Now, think about this. You've got a small band of rebel soldiers that up until this point have been fighting out of the hills and little villages, and now they're trying to hold Jerusalem and the environments, and 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry come marching down. Well, they managed to trap the Jewish army. Have any of you ever studied battle tactics from the Greeks? One of their great battle tactics was to deploy their army in three main sections. You would have a middle section, and then you would have a wing on the right flank and a wing on the left flank. And if you could possibly do it so that you got your enemy caught within, the sort of V shape that makes, then you could circle around behind him, surround him, and then everybody just jump on him and defeat him from all angles. Well, what they managed to do was catch Judas and his army inside of one of the wings and bring the wing around on his flank, encircle him, trap him, and kill Judas and a great many of his soldiers. So that was a massive defeat for the rebel army there. With Judas dead now, his youngest brother, Jonathan Aphus, takes the leadership. And Jonathan is an interesting character because he's not the firebrand that his brother was. He's got more of the politician in him. Still a leader, still leading the cause, but he is not of the state of mind that says, I will not negotiate with the Seleucids, I will take no prisoners, we're going to drive them out of the land and be done with them. No, he's willing to negotiate if it's to his advantage. Okay? So Jonathan takes the lead, and while he's doing that, his brother John Gotti, not G-A, is it G-O-T-T-I? The famous mafia guy? Not him. This guy is killed at Nabatea. He was trapped, killed by the Seleucids. That's the third casualty in the Hasmonean family at this point. All that are left alive are Jonathan and Simon Thasi that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Well, Jonathan reaches a truce with Bacchides. And one of the conditions of this truce ends up having Jonathan named the new high priest. Now, that's interesting. It's interesting for several reasons. One, he actually is a Levite. So at least insofar as, the tribal affiliation, they got that much right. Now, I don't recall seeing anything that said he was actually in the line to become high priest. Remember, the line is not just Levite. The tribe of Levi was composed of 3 clans. You had the clan of Merari, the clan of Gershon, and the clan of Kohath. The priests, like the high priest, only came from the clan of Kohath. Within the clan of Kohath, you had a number of families. For example, the family of Moses was from the clan of Kohath. But the family of Aaron also was from the clan of Kohath, and only the family of Aaron gave us the priests and the high priest. So a direct descendant from the line of Aaron within the clan of Kohath, within the tribe of Levi, and not only that, but he had to be the oldest living male descendant that was qualified to serve as a priest. Then and only then could he be high priest. Okay. I have seen nothing in any of my studies that indicated that Jonathan met all of those conditions. However, he had several things going for him. Number one, he's sort of homegrown. The Jews look at him as one of their own. Number two, he is in fact a Levite. Number three, he comes from the family of Mattathias that is viewed as being zealous for the purity of the law of Moses. And so the people accept him. They accept him not only as high priest, but also as what we might call ethnarch. What's an ethnarch? It's essentially a king in all but name. Okay? It's the leader of the ethnic group. Okay? And he never assumed a title of king during his lifetime, nor did his brother, by the way. But the next generation will begin to refer to themselves as kings. And so that's why we talk about the Hasmonean dynasty, is because the second generation will refer to themselves as kings. Now, he functioned essentially as a king without ever using that word. Now, anybody think of a reason why he might not have wanted to appropriate the title of king? What do you think?
People give you less, people want to take your power from you.
Well, there's that. It puts target on your back, especially to the Seleucids, because especially at this stage in history, that's openly proclaiming to the world, I'm setting myself up in opposition to the Seleucid king. Yeah, good. Greg?
He's from Levi, not from Judah.
Bingo. There you go. He's not descended from David. Judah only ever had kings that were descended from David. Remember? Even Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, who was not technically in the line of royal descent, was nevertheless of the family of the previous king. He was an uncle to the king that he replaced, and he was very much descended from David's branch of the line of Judah. Okay? Jonathan was savvy enough to know he wasn't from the line of Judah, from the family of David, and so he knew that if he claimed to be king, he would probably undermine his own authority by doing that in the eyes of the Jews, who were very, very conscious of their Old Testament history at this point. So he never claims to be king, nor does his brother Simon when it comes his turn to be the ethnarch. But he functioned in for all intents and purposes, as a king. All right, so now we have 3 of the brothers who end up leading the Jews in their order. You have Judas Maccabeus, who led until the Battle of Elisa. Of course, Eleazar died before Judas did, so he's out of the picture. Then when Judas dies, Jonathan becomes the leader, and shortly after, John Gotti dies, and he's out of the picture. And then Jonathan ends up dying in 143. He's betrayed and killed by Diodolus Tryphon. Diodolus is the regent who is appointed over the Seleucids. And Diodolus picks up on the fact that Jonathan is willing to negotiate and is willing to have talks with the Seleucids. And so he invites him to a conference. And it's all a ruse. The invitation to the conference is simply set up in order to ambush him and kill him. And that's exactly what happens. Now, he doesn't kill him right off the bat. At first, he imprisons him and sends a ransom demand back to Simon. And the ransom demand not only demands money, but also a certain number of hostages, which Simon rounds up and sends. But when they get there, they find out that Jonathan's already dead. So Theodolus sort of cut off that part of the leadership. However, this family is too well entrenched now in the leadership of the Jews. And cutting off Jonathan doesn't end the threat. In fact, it fires up the Jews a bit more. And so the last brother, Simon Thusi, takes over the ethnarchship and is appointed high priest. And so you begin to have this lineage of high priest and ethnarch that are serving, all with these brothers in the first generation. All right, now let's flip the board. So let's look at the family of Simon Thusi and what we might call the second generation. Simon had 3 sons and at least 1 daughter. We don't know the name of his daughter. It's never mentioned, as far as I know, in any of the extant historical documents. He may have had more than 1 daughter, but he had at least 1 daughter. Okay. That daughter married a man named Ptolemy, son of Abubus. Ptolemy was not related to the Ptolemies in Egypt, but Ptolemy was a fairly popular name at that time. And so he gets himself, let me push this over just a little bit so some of you can see. He gets himself appointed by the Seleucids as governor of Jericho. Now, stop and think just a moment. Geographically speaking, relative to Jerusalem, where is Jericho? Yeah, it's kind of northeast. So Jerusalem is essentially here, roughly level with the top of the Dead Sea. Jericho is down here in the edge of the Jordan River Valley, northeast of Jerusalem. Remember, for example, when Jesus is telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he talks about a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho? He was literally going down in elevation from the mountaintop of Jerusalem down into the Jordan River Valley. As a matter of fact, this end of the Jordan River Valley is quite a bit below sea level. If it weren't for the elevation of this mountain range, I guess the Mediterranean Sea would just spill over into there because it's quite a bit below sea level. Okay? So he he is the governor of Jericho, which is also one of the oldest cities in the world. He claims to be the oldest city in the world, but so does Damascus. But at any rate, he is governor, and he marries one of Simon Thusi's daughters. So he's the Seleucid governor of Jericho, and he's the son-in-law of Simon Thusi, who is essentially leading a rebel kingdom. We're not calling it that yet, but that's effectively what it is, out of Jerusalem. Interesting situation. If ever there were divided loyalties, that would be the case. I mean, that's way worse than an Alabama fan that marries a Tennessee fan, right? I mean, he's really in bad shape because he is in power thanks to the Seleucids, but he's married to the daughter of the leader of the rebels that are right in his backyard. Literally right up the mountain from him. Okay? Well, what does he do? He has a feast prepared at what as best I can tell, was sort of a citadel that he had built called Doc, D-O-K. And he invites Simon and his sons to the feast. And according to Josephus, when he had gotten them good and drunk, he and his men ambushed them. And they kill Simon and Mattathias, his oldest son, and Judas, his second son. By the way, let's pause a moment. Where do you suppose he got the names for his sons? By all accounts, he named Mattathias after his father and Judas after his brother. The only son who didn't go was the third and youngest son, whose name was John Hyrcanus. I say that. He's never referred to in the Maccabees, in the first and second Maccabees, as John Hyrcanus. He's simply referred to as John. The name Hyrcanus occurs once, and it's really not clear whether it's referring to him or not. But in some of Josephus's writings, which Josephus tells a lot of the same history, right? Josephus sometimes calls him John Hyrcanus or simply Hyrcanus. Okay? At any rate, he survives. Now, he is next in line to become ethnarch and high priest. And so he does. What do you think his first order of business is going to be? Track down and kill this traitor that killed his dad and his two brothers, right? Well, that would be all well and good, except for this traitor is really crafty. And in the confusion of all of this going on, he manages to seize John's mother and hold her hostage. So now he's got the trump card. John can't come and seek him out because he's got John's mother, and if he gets too close, he can torture her, kill her, do whatever he wants to do to her, right? And so John won't press the issue too hard. Yes, sir.
Which is his mother-in-law, right?
Yeah, it's his own mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Which again creates interesting family dynamics. I don't want to hear from you guys about wanting to put your mother-in-law in prison, okay? But in all seriousness, yes, it is his mother-in-law. And he's holding her hostage. So John never is able to root him out and kill him. Okay? But John ends up becoming the next generation. And under John's leadership, you begin to hear talk about the establishment of a Hasmonean dynasty, a kingship. And then John ends up having 5 sons named Aristobulus Judas, Alexander Jannaeus, Antigonus, Absalom, and 5th son. We actually don't know the name of the 5th one. We know he had 5, or Josephus tells us he had 5, but he only ever gives us 4 names. So 5th son. My question is, why would you name a son Absalom? Those of you who know biblical history, what's the story on Absalom?
Trying to kill his dad.
Yeah, he betrayed his father, David the king, and tried to usurp the throne from him, led a rebellion against him. I can't imagine a dad looking at his little baby boy and saying, I want to name him Absalom. But he did. At any rate, these guys form the next generation of Hasmonean kings now. And I'm not going to dive off into the world of third generation Hasmoneans tonight, because this is where it gets really tricky. You begin to have all these crossing lines in the web, and intrigue and conspiracies and assassination plots and all of these sorts of things, because this battle that started over we're not going to let these Greeks take the law of Moses away from us has turned into now we've got a hold of power. Because you see, the whole time all of this is going on, the Seleucids are falling apart. One, they've incurred the wrath of Rome, which is giving them grief from the West. 2, they're having a number of internal civil wars. Remember I told you that Antiochus IV was seen as a usurper, and he set a precedent that created problems later on? Well, sure enough, that precedent began to bear fruit, and a whole bunch of people started trying to usurp the leadership of the Seleucid Empire with all of its wealth, with all of its land, and they're having fits, which essentially means they don't have time and resources to expend on Judea. And so in the vacuum that's created there, the Hasmoneans come to power, and for all intents and purposes, they're free to rule as they want to, even though in name, they're still nominally subject to the Seleucids. So you have this development of this kingdom. All right, any questions or comments about all of that? Not going to dive off into that tonight, so I'll let you go early. Thank you so much for your attention.